Now, the last example I'm going to give is about California clapper rails, and that is, of course, an endangered species in the bay and determines a lot of management actions within this estuary. We worked on 3 South Bay marshes and looked at rails in the past year. We've gained about 6,000 locations on them and looked at high and low tide behavior of the rails to understand better in 3 different sites of the bay, these 3, whether or not there is already some effects of climate change. These 2 marshes, Colma Creek is right next to the airport here. Cogswell Marshes across the other side of the bay. The question is, between low and high tide, are we already seeing some changes, and can we tell how the rails are responding right now to these habitats? What we found, interestingly enough, already, and this, by the way, was done with the RTK GPS, like a month of time holding a thing like this. We had a grad student who was very dedicated and ended up with tennis elbow. But in this particular case, you can see that what happens underneath high tide events, birds find refugia and agatas hang out there. There's one there, there's one there. They have to be there, or the bird's subject to predation, or it doesn't have a way it can stay within these marshes, the few properties that it has available to it. So it's very important to be able to have that. And I'm going to finish with these 3 slides kind of summarizing what we're doing using water on top of the marsh plain. Now, this is from mean low water, mean low water, and up through mean high water of the inundation based on the current conditions. And you can see at mean low water, there's no water in the marsh. It gets to 1% at mean low water. In the middle, it's 0%, and then it kind of fills up over the plain, and the whole thing may be wet. Well, what happens if you apply a half-meter gain on that is you start to lose some of the time period where the marsh is not flooded. So it's not too big of a change here. It's kind of going to 20% or so in this area, 6% here. But when you get to the 1 meter change, then the marsh is flooded at least half the time, if not a lot more, and you only have 7% and 9% of the marsh is covered here, so you really have a lot less foraging time for the birds, a lot less habitat available, and with storm events that aren't included here, could be a tremendous loss of habitat, and basically a species that endangered may become critically endangered at that point. Laumeister, another case, is a worse case. It's a little bit deep, less high of a marsh, and that you can see in this case, then you get, again, more inundation as you look down to the higher tide levels. And the low tide levels, it's still pretty good, but there's not enough habitat during the high tides. And finally, even worse, in looking at this airport site, the Colma Creek site, is that most of it is inundated underneath both the conditions of a half-meter and a meter rise. That we're going to have trouble with this species relative to the marshes it's using right now, which, by the way, this particular marsh is Spartina alterniflora, the invasive, and it's being controlled for. So in the end, the directions we hope to do is to do studies of movements and phenology and look at and identify which species are most at risk and what habitat elements are most important for them. And then finally, look at the predation risk aspects and the habitat conditions that reduce it. And the management considerations are still trying to get the map elevations of these areas and focus on looking at transition areas. And hopefully that in the end, that restoration of areas would look at undeveloped upland areas is an important habitat, and acquisition or restoration is in a place unconstrained by levees may be prioritized to the top. Just that way you allow for the change in sea level rise to push your habitats uphill. Thanks.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Oh.
John, this may be a question for both you and Michelle. Is Michelle still here? I don't know. Maybe not. Anyway, you've identified, for several different species, you identified areas that where you're going to lose foraging area. Yeah. And I guess the question is, have you been modeling or working with anyone to identify potential new areas where they would gain foraging area so that some of that may be balanced?
No, and that's what Karen Thorne is a climate change student working with UC Davis, and her work is on the marsh that you saw in San Pablo Bay, where she's trying to now do the start of the modeling of looking at the habitat change, and that includes the increase in the water level that may increase the habitat. What might happen is the tidal marsh species will have to go to areas where it's available, but the species that are in the open bay may be sliding into what used to be tidal marshes. And we have to model that to figure it out. Yeah.
Another question?
Is the reduction in salt marsh extent over projected rates of sea level rise expected to affect food web dynamics in the South San Francisco Bay?
Well, I would say that, again, what we expect especially is both moving it upslope, but salinity changes are a big thing as far as invertebrate production, and as far as plants, it's going to be drowning. But as far as invertebrates, we think the community may change as salinity changes and temperature regime changes. That's going to be big. And trying to get a handle on which invertebrates that affects is going to be one of the research topics, I think.